My name is Brittany Holmes. I'm 38 years old, and for the past 15 years, I've been working as a corporate event planner. I'm the kind of person who thrives in chaos. Juggling deadlines, vendors, last-minute changes, and high-stakes clients is what I do. Every detail matters. The lighting, the seating arrangements, the flow of the evening, the quality of the catering, even down to the scent diffused subtly in the air. Events don't just happen, they're crafted. And I'm the architect behind many of them. If you've ever been to a flawless gala, a seamless product launch, or a memorable birthday celebration that everyone raves about long after it's over, chances are I had a hand in it. I'm meticulous, calm under pressure, and known for turning impossible ideas into stunning realities. But behind the scenes, it's a constant balancing act, not just professionally, but personally too. Because my work isn't just a 9-to-5 job. Between managing VIP clients and coordinating suppliers, there's the intricate dance of family obligations. You see, my family expects a lot from me. I'm not just Brittany the event planner. They see me as the one who handles all the details when it comes to family gatherings, birthdays, anniversaries, and celebrations. Often, I'm the one who funds extras out of my own pocket because, let's face it, sometimes the budget doesn't stretch as far as the vision. Take my father's 65th birthday party last weekend, for example. Months of planning went into it, selecting the perfect venue, arranging for the caterers, hiring the entertainment, and making sure everything reflected the kind of celebration Dad deserved. I was up late for weeks coordinating with vendors, double-checking contracts, and smoothing over last-minute hiccups. The party had to look effortless and grand because for my father, appearances mean everything. But despite all the hard work and financial strain, there was an undercurrent of tension. I could feel it. Subtle glances, clipped comments, and a coldness threading through conversations, especially from my sister Emily. She has a way of making you feel like you're on the outside, no matter how much you try to fit in. As I smiled and played the role of the perfect hostess, I couldn't shake the feeling that beneath the surface, something was off. Emily's presence at the party was like a shadow I couldn't outrun. She's always been charismatic, the golden child who commands attention with ease, effortlessly charming family and friends alike. But beneath that charm is a sharp edge, a knack for cutting down anyone who threatens her spotlight. I'd learned over the years to bite my tongue and keep my distance, but that night, as the evening unfolded and the champagne flowed, her barbs came out in full force. At one point, during the dinner, Emily leaned in close enough for others to hear and said, "Brittany, darling, maybe it's time you stopped pretending you're not broke. We all know you're just faking it." Her voice was loud enough to ripple through the table, causing a few uncomfortable chuckles and awkward glances from relatives and friends. I froze for a heartbeat, the room suddenly feeling too small, the walls closing in. But I forced a polite laugh, channeled years of practice at masking hurt, and tried to deflect. After all, I was the one who had organized this entire party. I wasn't going to let Emily's words ruin the night. Not yet. I smiled, keeping my voice steady as I responded, "Well, Emily, I guess it's a good thing the celebration's about Dad tonight, not who's the richest." But the damage was done. Her words planted a seed of humiliation deep inside me. I could feel the eyes on me, the subtle shift in atmosphere. Later, as the waiter approached with the check, a hefty $3,000 tab, I reached into my purse, pulled out my black card, and handed it over. It was my way of showing, quietly but firmly, that I was capable, that I belonged, that I could hold my own. But when the waiter returned, his expression was hesitant, eyes flicking down to his handheld device. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, voice unfamiliar with hesitation. "But your card has been declined." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. The table went deathly silent. I caught the briefest, most triumphant smirk on Emily's face. Whispers started circulating around the room like wildfire. The carefully constructed image I'd built for years, of control, success, and stability, crumbled in an instant. The restaurant manager hurried over with an apologetic smile, attempting to smooth things over. "Ms. Holmes, we're so sorry for the inconvenience. Unfortunately, there's an outstanding balance from last month's catering contract your family arranged with us. We'd be happy to discuss a payment plan, but beneath the apologies, the look in their eyes told a different story, one of judgment and disbelief. I swallowed my embarrassment, pushing down the rising panic and humiliation. This was my life, a delicate balance between public success and private struggle, where family expectations clashed with hidden betrayals, and where even the strongest facades could shatter under the weight of a moment's exposure. And as the murmurs grew louder around me, I realized that this night, my carefully guarded world was about to change forever. Favoritism in my family didn't just appear overnight. It was baked into the very fabric of our childhood, woven into every gathering, every conversation, every glance exchanged behind closed doors. Looking back now, I see how early it started, how my sister Emily was always the one who received praise, attention, and financial perks, while my own accomplishments seemed to fade into the background, barely acknowledged. It felt like I was living in the shadow of someone else's spotlight, a supporting character in a story where she was the star. As kids, Emily was the golden child, the one who got the best of everything. I remember family vacations where she was showered with gifts and affection, while I was often told to stay out of the way, like I was an afterthought rather than a daughter. Those trips were supposed to be moments of joy and bonding, yet I felt like a visitor in my own family. I wasn't invited to certain outings, or if I was relegated to the sidelines, watching as Emily was celebrated for being charming, talented, and successful. School achievements? Emily's were loudly praised and rewarded, posted on the refrigerator, bragged about to relatives who called her the smart one. When I brought home good grades or received awards, my efforts were often met with a polite nod or a half-hearted, "That's nice," as if my successes were expected and therefore unremarkable. It stung, but I learned to swallow the disappointment, telling myself it was normal family dynamics, that some siblings just get more attention. The financial disparities were even more glaring. Emily seemed to glide through life with access to resources I only dreamed of. She had the latest gadgets, clothes, and opportunities to attend expensive camps or courses, all quietly funded or approved by Dad, who never questioned her expenses. Meanwhile, I was expected to be content with hand-me-downs or to find ways to manage on my own. One of the most painful memories involves lending Emily money during what she called emergencies. I thought of them as sisterly support, a way to help her through tough times. But those loans were never repaid, not fully, and certainly not on time. When I gently reminded her or asked for the money back, I was met with excuses, dismissals, or outright silence. Dad, Richard Holmes, was at the center of this favoritism. His eyes always seemed to light up when Emily spoke or achieved something, and when I voiced my worries or tried to bring up concerns, he waved them aside. "You're overthinking things," he'd say, or, "Emily has a bright future. Focus on supporting her." That support, of course, meant he rewarded Emily's ambitions financially and emotionally, while I was left to handle my own. It was like he had decided early on that Emily's path was the one worth investing in, and mine was secondary, if considered at all. I think I tried to rationalize this imbalance for years. I told myself that family loyalty meant sacrifice, that if I could just keep giving, keep helping, eventually, my contributions would be recognized. Maybe if I kept funding events, organizing celebrations, and quietly supporting Emily's ventures, she would come to see me as an equal, and Dad would realize my worth beyond just being a dependable backup. But with every unreciprocated favor and every minimized achievement, that hope grew thinner. Even the way family gatherings were structured reinforced these dynamics. Emily was always seated in the place of honor, flanked by relatives eager to hear her stories and successes. I was often off to the side, expected to manage the logistics or handle the details so everyone else could relax and enjoy the spotlight. It was subtle, but the message was clear. Emily belonged at the center. I was an accessory. Despite all this, I clung to the belief that blood ties would eventually level the playing field. That family meant unconditional support and fairness. But those early years, filled with exclusion and quiet favoritism, planted seeds of doubt that would grow into the bitter realities I faced as an adult. The foundation of my family was not built on equality, but on selective affection and strategic alliances, with Emily always at the top, and me perpetually navigating a maze of disregard and invisible debts. Now, looking back, I realized that acceptance of this imbalance was my way of coping, but it came at a cost. It shaped how I saw myself and how I allowed others, especially my own family, to treat me. And as much as I tried to hold on to hope, the patterns set long ago were only becoming clearer and harder to ignore. I've made a lot of sacrifices over the years, more than most people realize. It's like my life has been on hold, constantly rearranged to support my family's needs, while my own dreams have been pushed to the back burner. I put my career on pause more times than I can count, shelving opportunities that could have taken me to the next level because there was always a family event to organize, a crisis to manage, or a budget to stretch that no one else wanted to touch. Take the catering bills, for instance. Nobody really talks about how often I've covered those costs out of pocket. When Emily wanted a lavish wedding venue, I didn't hesitate to step in and handle the payments, believing it was an investment in family peace. It wasn't just about the money. It was about trying to build bridges, to create moments where we all looked like we belonged in the same happy story. But those bills didn't just disappear, and neither did the strain I carried quiet and heavy in my chest as I wrote checks and waited for reimbursements that never came. There was this one time, right before Dad's big retirement party, when the caterer's invoice arrived with a price tag far beyond the original estimate. I remember staring at the numbers late into the night, the glow of my laptop screen bleeding into the dark kitchen where I sat alone. I made the decision then to cover the difference myself because I didn't want the party to look anything less than perfect. It wasn't just about the event. It was about preserving the family image, making sure Dad felt celebrated and respected. But the truth is, each check I signed, each extra dollar spent, was another thread in a tapestry of invisible debts and unspoken expectations. And it wasn't just about money. Caring for our aging grandmother was another responsibility that fell almost entirely on me. Emily was too busy building her social calendar and tending to her own family's needs, while I found myself driving Grandma to doctor's appointments, managing medications, and making sure her house was safe and clean. I didn't complain, not out loud, because I told myself this was what family meant, stepping up when others couldn't or wouldn't. But sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of Emily's dismissive smile or overhear her brushing off Grandma's needs as, not that big of a deal. It stung, but I buried the hurt deep. My husband Mark has been my rock through all this. He sees the toll it takes on me, the exhaustion in my voice, the tension I carry in my shoulders, but he also understands why I keep going. "You're the glue holding this all together," he tells me, sometimes with a touch of worry in his eyes. He knows the weight I bear, and he tries to help where he can, but even he senses the strain that family life imposes on me. There have been nights when I've come home late, frazzled from coordinating a last-minute vendor change or negotiating with a caterer, and he simply held me, wordlessly reminding me that I'm not alone. Still, despite all the sacrifices, despite the financial strain and the emotional labor, I clung to a flicker of hope, a belief that my efforts would one day be recognized. I thought that if I kept organizing, funding, and caring, I would finally earn my place at the table, not just as the planner, the helper, or the backup, but as someone respected and valued for who I truly am. Especially during milestone events like Dad's birthday, I imagined a moment when the family would look at me and see more than just the person who made the party happen. I dreamed they'd see the person who had weathered storms, held things together, and quietly carried their burdens. But hope, I've learned, can be fragile. For every generous gesture I made, for every dollar I covered, there seemed to be a subtle erasure of my contributions. Emily's effortless charm always seemed to overshadow the hard work I poured in, and Dad's blind favoritism reinforced the message that my sacrifices were expected, nothing more. Even when Mark and I talked about stepping back, about setting boundaries, I found myself pushing those thoughts aside, afraid that pulling away would mean losing the last thread that connected me to them. In the quiet moments, when the house was still and the world outside faded, I'd reflect on how much I'd given up. The postponed promotions, the opportunities declined, the personal dreams deferred, all for family. And yet, the recognition I craved remained elusive. It was a strange kind of loneliness, being surrounded by people who expected everything but seemed blind to what I needed. I kept telling myself this was temporary, that someday, somehow, things would be different. But deep down, the truth was settling in. Sacrifices without reciprocity were a one-way street, and the more I gave, the more the cracks in my family's facade began to show. The tension, the coldness from Emily, the dismissiveness from Dad, they weren't just fleeting moments. They were part of a larger pattern. Yet I held on to that fragile hope, because letting go felt like giving up on the family I loved, even if that family sometimes made me feel invisible. So I kept going, organizing, funding, caring, straining against the invisible walls of expectation and silence. I was the fixer, the supporter, the silent backbone of every celebration, every gathering, every crisis. And even as the weight grew heavier, I convinced myself that my sacrifices were love in action, that eventually, love would be returned. But looking back now, I wonder how much longer I could keep pretending that giving without getting was enough. The night of Dad's 65th birthday party was supposed to be a celebration, a milestone, a moment to honor the man who'd built so much for us all. I had spent months perfecting every detail. From the custom floral arrangements to the gourmet menu, nothing was left to chance. I wanted this night to be flawless, not just for Dad, but to finally feel a little seen, a little valued in a family that so often overlooked me. But the moment Emily's words cut through the room, everything shifted. We were seated around the grand banquet table, the soft glow of candlelight flickering against polished silverware and crystal glasses, the murmur of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the smooth jazz from the string quartet created an elegant atmosphere. I smiled as I toasted my father, trying to embed myself in the warmth of the evening, hiding the tightening knot forming in my stomach. Then Emily leaned in, that familiar sharp glint in her eyes, her voice just loud enough for half the table to catch. "Brittany, darling," she said with a sneer that barely masked her contempt. "Maybe it's time you stopped pretending you're not broke. We all know you're just faking it." The words dropped like a bomb. Heads turned, eyes flicked from Emily to me and back again. A few forced chuckles echoed around the table, but beneath them was an unmistakable undercurrent of shock and awkwardness. The warmth in the room turned cold, like a sudden winter chill creeping through the ornate dining hall. I froze for a split second. My heart hammered painfully against my ribs. Years of silent resentment, passed-over contributions, and unacknowledged sacrifices seemed to flash before my eyes in that cruel moment. But I was no stranger to masking hurt. I had perfected the art. I forced an easy smile and replied, my voice steady though my hands trembled slightly. "Well, Emily, I guess it's a good thing the celebration's about Dad tonight, not who's the richest." I could feel the burn of eyes on me, some skeptical, some sympathetic, others just curious. But Emily wasn't finished. She smirked, clearly pleased with the jab she'd landed, then swept her gaze across the table as if daring anyone to challenge her. The pain beneath her words was searing. I had long struggled beneath a facade, always trying to appear composed and competent. But that night, her accusation wasn't just a verbal jab. It was an exposure, an unmasking of every insecurity I'd tried to bury. Later, when the waiter approached with the check, a hefty $3,000 sum that reflected the lavishness of the evening, I reached calmly into my purse and pulled out my black card. It was sleek, embossed with gold lettering, a symbol of a life I'd fought hard for. To me, it was more than plastic. It was proof of my independence, my success, and my worth. I handed it over to the waiter with quiet confidence, determined to show that I was more than just Emily's spiteful words, that I could hold my own, and that my contributions to this family and this night were real. But moments later, the waiter returned, his expression shifting from polite professionalism to hesitant sympathy. His eyes flicked down to his device, brows knitting together. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, voice low, almost apologetic, "but your card has been declined." The words hit me like a freight train. The room seemed to drop into a suffocating silence. Forks paused mid-air, conversations stilled, and the soft background music seemed to fade away. I caught my father's surprised glance, the slight narrowing of eyes from family friends, and then, most painfully, the brief, triumphant smirk that flickered across Emily's face. Whispers began to ripple around the table, hushed voices growing louder, curiosity and disbelief mixing into a toxic cocktail. I could feel every gaze burning into me, stripping away the carefully maintained veneer of control and success I'd built. Before I could gather myself, the restaurant manager appeared, brisk and apologetic, stepping toward our table with a polished smile that failed to reach his eyes. "Ms. Holmes?" he began, voice measured but firm. "We're very sorry for the inconvenience. Unfortunately, there's an outstanding balance from last month's catering contract your family arranged with us, $500,000 to be precise. We'd be happy to discuss a payment plan or any arrangements you'd like to make." The words exploded in the silence like gunfire. $500,000. An amount so large it felt surreal, humiliating. I felt my chest tighten as the weight of the revelation crashed down on me. All those months of silently covering costs, of trusting that the family would honor their debts, exposed in the worst possible way. Behind the manager's polite tone, I detected a flicker of judgment, disbelief, and a hint of pity from some of the guests' faces. The very people I'd hoped to impress now saw the cracks, the fractures in the family's story of wealth and success. I swallowed hard, forcing my lips into a tight line as waves of panic, embarrassment, and anger surged inside me. Hot tears burned behind my eyes, but I blinked them away. This was not the moment to crumble. Not here. Not now. The party, once full of promise and joy, had transformed into a theater of humiliation. And despite the buzzing whispers and the heavy silence, I held my head high, masking the storm within. Because this moment wasn't just about a declined card or an unpaid bill. It was the catalyst for a reckoning long overdue. A reckoning that would force the family's hidden debts, debts of trust and respect as much as money, into the harsh light of day. And as I sat there, feeling the weight of every gaze, every whispered word, I knew the night was far from over. The carefully curated illusions of wealth and family harmony were unraveling, and beneath the surface, a battle for truth, dignity, and justice was beginning to take shape. Later that evening, when the formal party had dwindled into smaller clusters of conversation and the soft murmur of polite laughter, I found myself stepping away from the dining room. The weight of the earlier scene, the public decline of my card, and the manager's veiled accusations still pressed heavily on my chest. I wandered toward the quieter hallway leading to the lounge, hoping to gather my thoughts away from prying eyes. That's when I caught sight of Emily, her posture relaxed, eyes gleaming with a mixture of triumph and mischief, as she spoke animatedly with Dad in low tones. At first, I didn't mean to listen, but then her voice, sharp, self-assured, carried through the thin walls like a knife. I told Dad it was a bad idea to include Brittany in the profit sharing. She's always been reckless with money, making poor choices. It's better if she's out of the loop, Emily said, her tone almost gleeful. I convinced him. You know how stubborn he is, but this time he finally agreed. Dad's voice was quieter but unmistakably dismissive. I just don't want the business tangled up with family drama. Brittany's been unpredictable. It's safer this way. My heart stopped. Unpredictable. Reckless. Words I never imagined hearing from my own father, who had always been my benchmark for fairness, even if flawed. Emily continued, barely lowering her voice. Besides, those stories I've been spreading about her financial troubles, they're doing their job. People believe it. It's easier to keep her out when everyone thinks she's drowning in bad debts. I stood frozen in place, a cold wave sweeping over me. So this was the real game. Behind the scenes, Emily was actively erasing me, not just sidelining me from family celebrations, but systematically cutting me out of the family business, undermining my reputation, and turning Dad against me. I wanted to storm in, to confront them with everything I'd endured, to demand explanations, but the scene felt surreal, like watching a play from which I was not just excluded, but deliberately written out of the script. Mark had been nearby, leaning against the wall, his jaw clenched. He caught my eye, and I saw the mix of anger and helplessness mirrored there. He had witnessed too many silent betrayals, and now he saw the depths of it revealed like a wound exposed. As Emily continued, her voice dripping with satisfaction, I heard her boast about the rumors she'd spread, painted carefully to portray me as the unreliable, broke sister, a woman whose financial woes were self-inflicted. "It's worked wonders," she said with a smirk. "No one suspects the family is behind the real problems." Dad's voice softened, but the dismissiveness remained. "Brittany's always been difficult. You two never saw eye to eye. It's best to keep things simple." I felt something inside me fracture, a mix of betrayal, sorrow, and a kindling rage that had long been simmering beneath the surface. I had believed in family, in loyalty. Yet here was the raw truth. My sister and father had conspired to erase my role, to rewrite history so thoroughly that no one would question their narrative. As I stood there listening, I pieced together the extent of the conspiracy, the unpaid bills, the financial burdens I'd quietly carried, the exclusion from profit sharing, all deliberate moves designed to isolate me, to weaken me emotionally and financially. Mark stepped forward, his voice low but firm when he finally spoke to me. "We can't let this go unchallenged." I nodded, though inside I felt a chill. This wasn't just family drama anymore. It was betrayal on a level that demanded more than silent endurance. It was a calculated attempt to destroy my credibility and sever my ties to everything I had worked for. When I finally stepped back into the main room, the laughter and music resumed, but I was no longer just Brittany, the planner, or the overlooked sister. I was someone who now understood the depth of the duplicity, someone who would have to confront it head-on. But the question that throbbed in my mind was, how? How do you fight a family that's so determined to rewrite the story in their favor, especially when the father you trusted has become an ally to your erasure? The night's earlier humiliation was just the beginning. Now the real battle was laid bare, not in whispered accusations or declining cards, but in cold, deliberate betrayal. And I knew I couldn't afford to let it slide any longer. Later that night, when the party had finally wound down and the guests had drifted away in small clusters, I found myself alone in the quiet of our family home. The soft hum of the city outside barely penetrated the thick walls. Yet inside, my mind was anything but still. I leaned against the window, staring out into the dark, as my thoughts churned relentlessly. The sting of Emily's words echoed, sharp and unrelenting. "Stop pretending you're not broke." That simple phrase had cut through every layer of the carefully constructed armor I'd worn for years. I remembered the way the table fell silent after my card was declined, how the waiter's hesitant apology had felt like a public announcement of failure. My chest tightened again just thinking about the weight of that moment, the suffocating shame, the humiliation dressed in polite smiles and veiled glances. But beneath the surface of that raw pain, something else began to settle in me, a cold clarity, a hardening resolve. I wasn't naive anymore. This family, with all its glitz and grandeur, had always been a house of cards, fragile and built on selective truths and hidden debts. I knew now that my sacrifices hadn't been met with gratitude or fairness. Instead, they'd been exploited, taken for granted, and twisted into ammunition against me. I pulled out a worn notebook from my bag, a habit I'd developed over the years. It wasn't just for event details or vendor contacts. It was my ledger of sorts, where I jotted down invoices I'd paid personally, notes about calls with caterers who never received their full payments, and reminders of funds quietly funneled into family projects. Flipping through the pages, I realized how many times I had swallowed the bitter pill of unacknowledged debt. There was the $20,000 catering bill from last summer's gala that nobody else remembered but me, the unpaid floral arrangements for Mom's 60th birthday, twice the budget, but somehow covered without a word from the family. The emergency loan I gave Emily 3 years ago when her business was on the brink, money she never repaid and probably never intended to. Each entry was a story of quiet generosity met with silent betrayal. I closed the notebook slowly, the weight of years pressing down, But alongside the exhaustion, a resolute fire flickered to life. This wasn't just about money. It was about respect, honesty, and reclaiming my dignity. I thought about the countless times I had rationalized the imbalance, telling myself that blood meant loyalty, that family deserved sacrifice. But now I saw the truth. Loyalty had been one-sided, and sacrifice had been twisted into subservience. Tears welled up, but this time they weren't just for the past. They were for the future I was determined to change. I thought of Mark, his steady presence beside me, the quiet strength that reminded me I wasn't alone. I imagined a life where I no longer carried the weight of other people's debts, emotional or financial, a life where I could stand tall without apology. As dawn crept over the horizon, I drafted a silent vow in my heart. No more enabling, no more ignoring the harsh realities. The pain I felt was real, but it was also a catalyst, a spark that would ignite a path forward. I would gather every fact, every contract, every record of unpaid debts and broken promises. I would build a case, not out of spite, but out of necessity. The time for quiet sacrifice was over. With each deep breath, I felt the fog of grief begin to lift. I was no longer just the overlooked sister or the silent supporter. I was a woman awakening to the truth and ready to fight, not with anger, but with unshakable resolve. The battle ahead would be difficult, but I knew the first step was acknowledging what had been done to me and accepting that I deserved better. I wiped away the last tear and looked into the mirror. The woman staring back wasn't broken. She was bruised, yes, but unbowed. And as the sun rose, painting the room in pale gold, I realized something vital. This was no longer just about family. It was about reclaiming my own story, one chapter at a time. In the quiet hours after the party, alone in the stillness of our family home, the weight of everything pressed down on me like a physical force. The humiliation at the restaurant, the whispers, Emily's cruel words, Dad's dismissal, it all played on a loop in my mind. But amidst the noise of doubt and pain, a new clarity began to take shape. I realized that if I was ever going to reclaim my dignity, I would have to be methodical, precise, and unyielding. This wasn't just about hurt feelings anymore. This was about facts, numbers, and undeniable proof. I pulled out my battered notebook, the one I'd kept for years, often tucked away in the bottom of my event planner bag, usually filled with vendor contacts, deadlines, and budget notes. But hidden within its pages were something far more important, a detailed record of every financial transaction I'd made on behalf of the family, every invoice I'd paid, every contract I'd signed, every phone call where I'd negotiated extensions or partial payments, all meticulously noted down. What once felt like invisible burdens now transformed into tangible evidence. I spent the next hours flipping through the pages, cross-referencing with emails, text messages, and bank statements stored on my laptop. It was exhausting, but necessary. I listed out every unpaid invoice from the catering companies who had been patient, but were beginning to grow restless. I gathered copies of contracts where I had personally guaranteed payments, contracts that Emily had signed off on but then ignored when it came to settling the bills. There were payment reminders I'd sent to family members, ignored or brushed aside, and promises made but never fulfilled. It was a trail of broken commitments and financial neglect, all pointing to one undeniable fact. I had been the one keeping everything afloat. I organized everything into neat folders on my computer: unpaid invoices, contracts, communications, and receipts. Each folder was a piece of the puzzle, and together they formed a picture I was finally ready to confront. It wasn't just about the money, it was about accountability. Next, I reached out discreetly to a trusted accountant, someone outside the family, professional, and unbiased. I explained the situation without revealing every detail, but enough to get a sense of the financial implications. She was appalled by the scale of unpaid debts and the way funds had been mismanaged or overlooked. She helped me draft a financial summary that clearly showed the amounts owed, payment deadlines missed, and the resulting interest and penalties that had accumulated. The numbers weren't just shocking. They were a testament to the negligence and exploitation I'd endured. Alongside this, I consulted a family lawyer, carefully chosen for their experience with complex family business disputes. I wanted to know my legal standing. How could I protect what was rightfully mine? What recourse did I have to reclaim funds and secure my financial future? The lawyer was patient but straightforward, affirming that I had a strong case, given the documentation I had amassed. She also advised me to begin securing my personal assets, updating wills and power of attorney documents to prevent further family interference. It was a sobering step, but necessary. Meanwhile, I kept up appearances at family gatherings, maintaining a calm, composed facade. No one suspected the storm brewing beneath my polite smiles and measured words. I watched Emily carefully, her confident stance, her smug smiles, and felt none of the fear or anxiety that had gripped me before. Instead, a quiet fire burned, fueled by the knowledge that I was no longer powerless. I began identifying the family's dependencies, how deeply intertwined they were with my event planning expertise, my financial backing, and my contacts. Without me, many of their ventures would stall. The catering companies, the entertainment bookings, the vendor relationships I'd cultivated over years. They all depended on my involvement and my credit. I realized that this leverage was my lifeline, my way to shift the balance. Yet, I knew timing was crucial. I couldn't just confront them head-on without preparation. I needed patience and precision. Every email, every phone call, every contract had to be in order. No loose ends. If I was going to expose the truth, I had to do it with undeniable facts that left no room for denial or manipulation. Late into the night, I drafted a plan, a roadmap of the steps I would take, letters of formal notice, calls to vendors to confirm debts, legal filings if necessary. I would demand accountability, not just for the money, but for the respect I was owed. This was about reclaiming my place, not just financially, but emotionally. I also resolved to protect Mark and myself from the fallout. Our joint assets would be secured, and I would keep him informed every step of the way. His support was my anchor, and I needed to shield our life from the escalating family drama. As the dawn's first light crept through the window, I sat back, exhausted, but resolute. The battle ahead would be tough, but for the first time in a long while, I felt in control. The ledger of unpaid debts and broken promises was no longer a silent burden. It was my weapon, and I was ready to wield it. I began the slow process of withdrawing my support from the family, and it wasn't dramatic or confrontational at first. Instead, I chose subtle, deliberate moves that required no immediate explanations, but would gradually shift the balance. The weight of months, no, years, of unacknowledged sacrifices and betrayal had hardened into cold resolve. I knew I had to protect myself, financially and emotionally, before I could confront the deeper wounds. The first step was declining new family event requests. Normally, if someone called needing help with a last-minute venue booking, a caterer recommendation, or a vendor contact, I'd jump in without hesitation. But now, I started to say no. When my mother called asking if I could coordinate the upcoming Anderson family reunion, I paused. I could almost hear Emily's voice in the back of my mind, the disdain she'd shown at Dad's party. Instead of agreeing, I told Mom, "I'm tied up with a few work projects right now. It's best you find someone else this time." I left my voice calm, neutral, but firm. There was no room for argument. It felt strange at first, this quiet refusal. People who were used to relying on me noticed and asked if I was okay. I smiled and said I was just busy, overworked. That was true. I had plenty on my plate, but it was also a boundary I was drawing. I wasn't about to explain the tangled family politics or the bitterness I carried. Not yet. Alongside declining new requests, I began reducing financial advances. Where I once covered catering bills without question or fronted money for family events, I started holding back. When Emily asked for a loan to cover some last-minute expenses for her boutique's anniversary party, I hesitated. There was the familiar tug of guilt, the urge to help, but I pushed it aside. "I'm sorry, Emily. My finances are tight this month. You'll have to find another way," I said plainly. No excuses, no sugarcoating. The silence on the other end was telling. I also took steps to remove myself from ongoing business dealings that had tied me too closely to family projects. I changed passwords on shared email accounts, vendor portals, and financial platforms. Accounts that I had set up and managed, sometimes without fanfare, were now off-limits to me. I informed vendors that going forward, Emily or Dad would handle contracts and payments directly. It was a calculated move to distance myself and also to observe how things would unfold without my oversight. There was a strange satisfaction in this quiet withdrawal. For years, I had been the family's invisible backbone, the silent guarantor of their events and ventures. Now, I was reclaiming my space. I stayed composed and polite in family gatherings, never revealing the full extent of my intentions. I wore the mask of calm professionalism, even as my mind tracked every interaction, every word, every subtle glance. I also sent formal notices for overdue payments. This was the most difficult part. I drafted letters addressed to Emily and Dad, carefully worded but firm, reminding them of unpaid invoices and outstanding balances. I requested immediate settlement, or at least a plan to address the debts. I knew these letters would ruffle feathers, but I needed to establish a paper trail, undeniable proof of my position. At the same time, I hinted at possible legal action, not overtly threatening, but enough to make clear I wasn't willing to be the family's financial safety net any longer. I watched as Emily's confident facade flickered once or twice during family dinners, as she threw cautious looks my way. Dad's usual dismissiveness seemed tempered with unease, though he never confronted me directly. The subtle distancing began to unsettle the family dynamic. Whispered conversations paused when I entered the room, and I could sense the shifting undercurrents. Yet, they didn't know the full scope of what I was building behind the scenes. A network of documentation, financial records, and legal counsel that would soon confront them all. This was more than just cutting back on support. It was setting the stage for accountability, for exposing the truth behind years of exploitation and dismissal. I was no longer the quiet fixer or the overlooked sister. I was preparing to take control, and the family had no idea how thoroughly I planned to change the game. The next major family event arrived with all the usual pomp and expectation, a charity gala held at one of the city's most prestigious venues. The air buzzed with anticipation, the soft hum of well-dressed guests mingling beneath glittering chandeliers. I'd spent weeks orchestrating every detail behind the scenes, as always. But this time, everything was different. I was no longer the quiet fixer, the woman who silently absorbed every slight and shouldered every unpaid bill. Tonight, I was ready to reveal the truth. As I entered the ballroom, the familiar faces turned toward me, curious, polite, some wary. Emily caught my eye, her smile tight, a flicker of unease betraying her confidence. Dad nodded stiffly from across the room, surrounded by his usual circle of business partners and family friends. I felt the weight of their expectations, but beneath it, a current of tension I had quietly nurtured for months. I made my way to the center of the room where a raised platform had been set up for speeches. Clearing my throat, I stepped up with the calm composure I'd honed over years of managing high-pressure events. "Thank you all for coming tonight," I began, my voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. "As many of you know, I've handled the planning and execution of our family's events and business ventures for years." A few heads nodded, some murmured agreements. "But there's an important matter I must address, one that affects all of us." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. I looked out across the sea of faces, locking eyes with Emily, who shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Over the past year, I have covered significant costs for family projects, including catering contracts, venue fees, and other expenses that have gone unpaid. I clicked the remote, and a large screen lit up behind me with detailed spreadsheets, invoices, and contracts. To be exact, there is an outstanding debt of over $500,000 owed to me personally. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some guests exchanged stunned glances, others whispered quietly. I continued. "These are not just numbers on paper. They represent months of financial support I extended in good faith, believing in our family's unity and honesty." My voice was calm, but resolute. Unfortunately, despite repeated requests, these debts remain unsettled, and I have been excluded from the family business's profit-sharing agreements. The room grew heavy with silence. Emily's face drained of color. Dad avoided my gaze altogether. From my bag, I pulled out copies of contracts, payment records, and email communications, carefully organized and verified. I've shared these documents with close relatives and business partners because transparency is essential. The days of overlooked contributions and hidden betrayals end here. I glanced at Emily again, whose bravado had dissolved into a tight-lipped stare. The murmurs intensified, whispers of shock and disbelief spreading like wildfire. Some family members looked at me with newfound respect, others with stunned recognition of the truth they had long suspected but never confronted. I had taken control of the narrative, dismantling the carefully constructed facade Emily and Dad maintained. "This is not about revenge," I said firmly, "but about accountability and fairness." I set the documents down on the podium, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "I am announcing my formal withdrawal from all ongoing family business dealings until these matters are resolved. I demand transparency, respect, and a fair acknowledgement of my contributions." As I stepped down, the room buzzed with tension. Emily's eyes burned with fury and disbelief, but she was silenced by the weight of the evidence and the crowd's shifting sympathies. Dad's usual authoritative presence seemed diminished, his posture defensive. Outside the spotlight, I caught Mark's eye. His silent nod gave me strength. I had laid my cards on the table, exposing the truth with clarity and undeniable proof. The family's carefully maintained illusion of unity and financial competence cracked wide open. This was only the beginning of a reckoning they could no longer ignore. And as the guests processed the revelations, I felt a mix of relief and anticipation, a quiet assurance that from this moment forward, the game had changed. The balance of power was shifting, and I was no longer the invisible sister but a force demanding justice on my own terms. The aftermath hit like a thunderclap. Almost immediately after I laid everything bare at the gala, the family was plunged into chaos. Emily's ventures, which had always depended heavily on my support, both financial and professional, began to falter. Her boutique's anniversary party was abruptly postponed, vendors pulling out or demanding immediate payment. The seamless illusion she'd maintained for years cracked visibly, leaving her scrambling to find quick fixes. At the same time, Dad, Richard, found himself under a squeezing spotlight too. Business partners, once comfortably distant from our family dramas, started asking pointed questions. Whispers of financial instability and unpaid debts circled through boardrooms and networking events. The sterling reputation Dad had built was suddenly at risk, and I heard through mutual acquaintances that some partners were reconsidering their commitments. It was clear that the cracks I exposed weren't just personal. They threatened the very foundation of the family's business empire. My phone didn't stop buzzing. Calls came in rapid succession, some tentative, others desperate. Emily was the first. Her voice was strained, no longer the confident tone I was used to over the years. "Brittany, please, can we talk? I didn't mean for things to get this out of hand. Let's find a way to fix this," she pleaded during one of the late-night calls. I could hear the panic just beneath her words, but I kept my responses measured. "Emily, this isn't about emotions anymore. It's about responsibility and making things right." Next came Dad, his usual commanding voice tinged with worry. "Brittany, we need to discuss this privately. Family is family. Let's not let business ruin what we have." I wanted to believe there was still a chance for reconciliation, but the cold truth lingered between us. "Dad, family means respect and fairness. That's been missing for a long time." Then there was Karen, Emily's mother-in-law, whose calls were laced with guilt and thinly veiled blame. "Brittany, you have to understand where we're coming from. You're hurting Emily and your father. Please consider stepping back for the family's sake." Her words stung, a reminder of the alliances that had formed against me, an entire front of judgment and pressure meant to isolate me. Even Mark found himself caught in the crossfire. Extended family members reached out to him, trying to sway him into mediating or persuading me to relent. At one point, I overheard Mark on the phone, firm yet diplomatic, explaining, Brittany is standing her ground for a reason. This isn't about grudges. It's about justice. Throughout this storm, I held my ground. Each call, each message was a test of my resolve. The pleas, the guilt trips, the veiled threats, they all crashed against the wall of my determination. I refused to be the family's silent bank or emotional punching bag any longer. Outside the immediate family, whispers began to spread among friends and community members who had long admired Emily's golden child image. The story was shifting. People started asking questions, noticing inconsistencies, and quietly aligning with my side of the story. Slowly but surely, Emily's carefully cultivated reputation began to crumble, replaced by skepticism and doubt. The isolation became tangible. Emily grew defensive, lashing out in private with veiled accusations and dramatics, trying to rally support from distant relatives. But the tide had turned. Many who had once turned a blind eye were now watching closely, their sympathies quietly realigning. I documented every interaction meticulously: calls, texts, meetings, creating a clear record not just for legal reasons, but to maintain my own clarity and control. Despite the emotional toll, this process was strangely empowering. I wasn't just surviving the fallout, I was steering it. The family's scramble revealed cracks far deeper than I'd anticipated. Foreclosure notices found their way to family properties. Contracts slipped through fingers. Social circles contracted as old friends and business partners distanced themselves. The veneer of unity shattered, exposing the raw, painful fractures beneath. And through it all, I never wavered. The calls, the pleas, the panicked messages, they only confirmed one thing: that my decision to stand up, to demand accountability, was the right one. The family had to face the consequences of their choices. The question now wasn't if they would recover. It was whether they could rebuild with honesty or remain divided by secrecy and betrayal. As the dust began to settle, I felt a quiet, unshakable certainty taking root. This was far from over, but for the first time, the balance had tipped. I was no longer the forgotten sister in the background. I was a force, focused, resolute, and ready to see this through. The fallout from my public confrontation was swift and brutal, shaking the foundation of a family that had long been propped up by fragile pretenses. Almost overnight, foreclosure notices began landing on the family's properties, letters stamped with ominous red warnings that felt like punches to the gut. Houses that had once been symbols of status and legacy now bore the weight of financial neglect, a tangible reminder of the cracks beneath the glossy surface. The family estate, the charming lake house where we spent summers, was suddenly at risk. I could almost hear the silent echo of my father's laughter in those rooms, now shadowed by uncertainty. Business contracts that had once flowed in with steady predictability started slipping through fingers like sand. Vendors who had tolerated delayed payments for years now pulled back, hesitant to extend credit or services without immediate guarantees. Friends in the industry whispered of unreliable partnerships and questioned the family's financial integrity. Deals that had been in motion for months stalled, leaving projects abandoned and reputations tarnished. It was as if the entire network of support that Emily and Dad had carefully cultivated was unraveling in real time. And the social circles we once moved in? They began to distance themselves with thinly veiled excuses and subtle withdrawals. Invitations stopped arriving, and familiar faces turned away with polite but unmistakable coldness. In the eye of this storm, Emily's response was nothing short of desperate theatrics. Stripped of her usual confidence, she slipped into the role of the victim with practiced ease, turning on the charm when needed and weaving narratives to elicit sympathy from allies both near and far. I heard through the grapevine that she was telling anyone who would listen that I was the one causing division, portraying herself as the wronged sister betrayed by greed and jealousy. She reached out to distant relatives, rallying them to her cause with tearful calls and dramatic messages, trying to sway their loyalties by twisting the story to fit her narrative. Threats surfaced too, veiled warnings that my actions were tearing the family apart and that there would be consequences if I didn't relent. It was a familiar pattern: manipulation cloaked in hurt, guilt wielded as a weapon. But this time, the mask slipped more often than not, revealing cracks in her facade. Amid the chaos, some family members showed signs of genuine regret. Quiet apologies came from aunts and cousins who admitted they hadn't fully realized the extent of my sacrifices or the depth of Emily's manipulations. Their remorse was bittersweet. Too little, too late. But it underscored the isolation I now faced. The family was splintering, with lines drawn sharply between those who stood with me and those who remained loyal to Emily and Dad's version of events. I documented every interaction, every call, text, and meeting, methodically creating a record that was as much for my sanity as it was for any potential legal process. Keeping that control was crucial. Without it, the emotional toll might have overwhelmed me. The wider community, too, began to shift their perception. Friends who had long admired Emily's polished image started to whisper among themselves, questioning the stories they'd been told. At charity events and industry mixers, I caught sight of knowing looks and subtle nods of solidarity. It was as if the truth I'd laid bare was finally piercing through the carefully constructed veneer of success and charm. Emily's once untouchable reputation was crumbling, replaced by skepticism and doubt that spread quietly but relentlessly. I could sense Emily growing increasingly volatile. Behind closed doors, her defenses hardened and her tantrums grew more frequent. She lashed out with sharp words and accusations, attempting to intimidate those who might waver in their loyalties. But the tide was turning. The alliances she had counted on were eroding, leaving her isolated and exposed. Through it all, I maintained my poise. The calls and messages came in waves, pleas laced with guilt, threats veiled as concern, frantic attempts to negotiate peace. But I held firm. I wasn't just fighting for money or recognition anymore. I was fighting for my dignity, my future, and the truth. The family's facade of unity was shattered, laying bare the fractures that had long been hidden beneath polite smiles and staged celebrations. Foreclosure notices, lost contracts, and social ostracism were not just consequences. They were wake-up calls. Whether they chose to rebuild honestly or remain fractured by deception was a choice they had to make. And as the dust settled around me, a quiet certainty settled within. The balance of power had shifted, and there was no going back to the way things were. The air felt lighter after the storm, lighter, but charged. I stood at a crossroads I never imagined reaching, looking out over the shattered landscape of what once felt like family. The years of sacrifice, the unseen debts, and the silent endurance had brought me here. Not to reconciliation or forgiveness, but to clarity and choice. I knew now that if my family wanted a future with me in it, it had to be on entirely new terms. No more silent suffering, no more erasure. I sat down one quiet evening with Mark, our home humming softly around us, the children asleep upstairs. He reached across the table, his fingers finding mine, grounding me in the calm that had been my anchor throughout this chaos. "Whatever you decide," he said softly, "I'm with you." His unwavering support was the bedrock beneath the shifting sands of family turmoil. Together we crafted what felt like a contract, not a legal document, but a personal manifesto, a set of boundaries so clear, so firm, that even the most stubborn family member would have to reckon with them. Respect, honesty, equality. These weren't just words. They were demands born from years of being overlooked, dismissed, and manipulated. Any future contact would hinge on these principles. If they couldn't meet these terms, then I would protect myself by stepping away, permanently if necessary. Writing that out was both liberating and heartbreaking. It was the end of an era, the end of hoping for change without consequences. I realized that love without respect was hollow, that family ties didn't obligate me to accept abuse or injustice. My sense of self-worth now demanded I prioritize my dignity and peace. In the weeks that followed, I shared this stance carefully with those closest to me. Mark, a few trusted friends who had witnessed the cracks and the pain. Their support bolstered my resolve. I declined invitations to strained family gatherings unless those boundaries were acknowledged ahead of time. I stopped answering calls that started with veiled criticisms or guilt trips. It was painful, but necessary. I was no longer the fixer or the silent guardian of a family that had too often forgotten me. Instead, my focus turned inward and outward, to the people who truly mattered. Mark and I planned more family time with our children, creating memories rooted in love without condition. I reconnected with friends who'd stood by me quietly, their messages of encouragement like rays of light after a long storm. I allowed myself moments of joy, unshadowed by past burdens. Slowly, a new peace began to settle. Hosting a small, intimate gathering at our home was a turning point. Instead of a grand event fraught with unspoken tensions, it was a warm, honest space filled with laughter and authentic connection. Mark grilled in the backyard while the kids ran around, and the friends who came brought with them kindness, understanding, and no hidden agendas. That night, I saw what true family could feel like: support without strings, acceptance without judgment. It was a balm for my weary soul. Yet, even as I embraced this new chapter, the larger family remained a complicated reality. The path forward wasn't about erasing the past, but setting firm boundaries to protect my future. I was clear that any engagement with Emily, Dad, or others would come with the expectation of respect and equal footing. No more accommodations for their favoritism or manipulations. The reckoning I had forced upon them was a wake-up call, a chance to grow or remain fractured by their choices. But that was their journey, not mine. I had chosen freedom over familiarity, dignity over denial. My story was no longer defined by what I endured, but by how I stood up, how I reclaimed my voice. In the quiet moments, when the world slowed down and the noise softened, I felt a deep, steady strength rising within me. The love I had for my family hadn't vanished, but it had transformed, tempered by wisdom and self-respect. And with that transformation came a new kind of hope. A hope not for old patterns to repeat, but for boundaries to be honored, for relationships to heal honestly, or, if necessary, to peacefully part ways. This journey taught me something profound: that blood ties are not a binding chain, but a choice. And sometimes, the bravest act of love is to let go, to protect yourself so you can thrive. I no longer needed to prove my worth through sacrifice or silence. My worth was inherent, undeniable, and I was finally living in alignment with that truth. As I closed the door on that chapter, I stepped into a life where respect was non-negotiable, honesty was the norm, and equality was the foundation. This was my new family, one built not on convenience or appearances, but on genuine connection and mutual regard. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to walk, with my head held high and my heart open.